Amos had got into the back, onto the bench seat, giving Elena access to the door. Amos reached out and gathered Medea in his arms. Elena seized her too, and the three of us bundled the girl into the rear beside Amos. I was wishing so hard she wasn't dead. Elena fired one last time and fell back into the passenger seats. I jumped in, yelling at her to slam the hatch. There was no time to strap in. Multiple shots slammed against the aircraft's flank. A window panel burst. Dents appeared in the inner skin, spalling fragments off the hull. I hoisted us off the ground and spun us to face the charging raiders. I think, although I can't be sure, I said something singularly unedifying as I pressed the trigger, something like, "Eat this, you bastards." I don't believe I actually hit any of them, but, by the Golden Throne, they took cover. "Sir!" Elena yelled over the scream of the turbofans. A ball of light was approaching from the other side of the spinney. I couldn't see the speeder, just the stab light, shining like a white dwarf against the night sky. Time to go. I kept it low, but pulled away south across the paddock at full thrust, accelerating all the time. We were doing 45 knots by the time we reached the road. The woods loomed. In an instant I weighed my options. Go high over the trees and be a clear target for any pursuer. Go through, lights off, and drop speed dramatically to avoid collision. Go through, lights on. I picked the third way. The flyer's lamps kicked on, lighting a cone of space ahead of us. Even with the lights and the auspex and the proximity alarm, this course was borderline suicide. Within a few seconds, having only just avoided a head-on smash with a mature spruce, I had to drop the speed to 30. You're going to get us killed, Elena wailed. Be quiet. The black shapes of tree trunks whipped past on either side, forcing me to turn and bank hard, repeatedly, jagging left, then right, then left again. Branches, some as massive as trees in their own right, swept over us like arches or under us like bridges. Several times we exploded through sprays of canopy, the engine-out alarm pipping as the fans fought to clear away the leaf debris choking them. The phantoms on the scanner screen were almost constantly red. Elena started to say an imperial prayer. "Say one for us all," I barked. "Amos, what's Medea's condition?"
She's alive, thank the stars, but her breathing's not right. Perhaps a collapsed lung or internal cauterization. She needs a medic, Gregor.
She'll get one. Make her as comfortable as you can. There's a medipack in the locker behind you. Patch her wound. Apart from being an insane death wish, flying at speed through dense, ancient forest at night was baffling. Simply avoiding collision required such concentration, I kept losing my bearings. A few forced turns to the left, say, pointed us east. Correcting that and evading an oak to the right, and we were turned west. We were zigzagging through the wild woodland, and a zigzag is not the fastest route of escape. At least 4 of the 5 speeders I had seen during the raid were after us. 2 were following us directly through the trees, about 500 meters behind us. The other 2 had gone up and over the tree cover, making much better time, chasing hard to pass over us and get ahead. They were ex-military models. I'd seen that much from the glimpse I'd got of them parked on the lawns. Bigger power plants than this nimble Urdeshi turbofan, bigger and better armored. And their cannons, mounted on racks in the doorframes, meant they could essentially fire in any direction. They didn't have to be pointing at their target. The auspex started to chime, and I saw hard light flash down through the leaf cover above us, breaking through in shafts like a sun breaking through low cloud. One of the flyers above the forest was matching us for speed. I jinked and evaded, not so much to lose him as to avoid instant obliteration against the bole of a tree. I saw the forest floor convulse and ripple as the door gunner fired down at us. So I banked hard, one wing down, right around a colossal fanewood, and shot off in a westerly direction. The overhead lights disappeared for a moment, but then reappeared, travelling fast, parallel to us, to the left. A tree, flashing past to my right, lost its bark in a blitz of diagonal crossfire. Damn them! I was fairly certain they had no heat or motion-tracking instruments. They were following the glow of my lamps underlighting the canopy. I killed the lights, but unfortunately didn't kill my speed. The proximity alarm squealed, and though I yanked on the stick, we struck a trunk a grazing blow. We wobbled hard. The engine-out alert shrilled a continuous note. The starboard fan had stalled. I went to hover and pressed restart on the starboard unit, hoping that it had simply been jolted dead by the impact. If the casing or the fan itself were buckled, restarting might be very messy indeed for all of us. The dead fan turned over and coughed. I tried again, another mewling wheeze. 20 meters behind us, the forest was coming to pieces in a deluge of wood pulp, bark scraps, and pulverized foliage, as the flyer high above tried to smoke us out with a sustained salvo. The starboard fan whipped into life on the third attempt. Staying at hover, I played the stick back and forth and side to side, pitching and yawing the craft, dropping its nose and then its tail, dipping the stubby wings, just to make sure I hadn't lost any attitude control. It seemed all right. I looked over my shoulder and saw Elena staring at me, her face corpse pale. Amos was cradling Medea.
"Are we all right, Gregor?" he whispered.
"Yes, I'm sorry about that." The glade to our left suddenly lit up with vertical shafts of light and was pummeled by cannon fire. They were still searching blindly. I had a sudden moment of recall. A void duel. Seriously outnumbered. Midas flying by the seat of his well-tailored pants. I remember him glancing at me from the controls of the gun cutter and saying, "Mouse becomes cat. Mouse becomes cat." Still hovering, I rotated the flyer towards the blitzed glade and then raised the nose slowly, pointing it at the light source above the trees, aiming it at the light source. I squeezed the toggle, just for a second. The lance beam seared up into the backlit canopy. There was a brief flash, and then a 9-ton metal fireball that had once been a speeder simply dropped down into the clearing, smashing through the branches, ripping apart and hurling flaming debris in all directions. "Scratch one," I said, smugly. Well, it's what Midas would have said. There were lights behind us, zooming closer through the forest. Keeping the lamps off, I nudged us away from the wreckage inferno and turned in behind a twisted antler bark that had slumped sideways in old age. Curtains of moss draped from its weary branches. I watched the lights approach, easing the nose around to follow the nearest one. They had slowed down, hunting for signs of us. The nearest lights were tantalizingly close, but obscured by a line of fat oaks. The other ones zipped in towards the blazing crash site. I swung us up, leading the flyer's nose towards the coasting speeder. It came into view, stab lights sweeping the woodland floor. I fired again. The shot was pretty good. It sheared the tail boom off the speeder. With its rear end discharging blue electrical arcs, it spun out of control, end over end. It made a mess of a giant fanewood, and vice versa. The other speeder came out from the cover of the oaks, firing right at us. The shots rent aside the curtains of moss. I realized someone had had the sense to bring night vision goggles. They could see us. I tried one shot, missed, and then turned tail, kicking in the floods and raising the speed as high as I dared. The proximity alert screen was just an overlapping red blur now, and we were all thrown around by the violent turns I was forced to make. The pilot of the speeder chasing us was good, distressingly good. Like the Merc foot troops, he was clearly the best of his kind money could buy. He stuck to my tail like a leech. Pushing 38 knots, I caroomed through the dense trees, pulling G's sometimes when the turns demanded it. He raced after me, following my lead and enjoying the gain of my turbo-wash slipstream. The chase was verging on balletic. We snaked and crisscrossed between trees, banked and looped like dancing partners. Several times I stood on a wingtip coming round one side of a big tree, and he mirrored the move coming round the other. Fans screaming, I pulled a hard turn to the north, and then rolled, reversing, turning south. He overshot, but was back a moment later, accelerating fast onto my tail. Tracer rounds winked past me. 2 hard jolts came in quick succession, and the instruments confirmed what I suspected. We'd been hit. I was losing power, not much, but enough to suggest a battery had been ruptured or disconnected. He was firing again, stitching lines of tracer shells spat past the cockpit. Now I had distress runes lighting up on my control panels. Something drastic was needed, or we'd be his latest cockpit stripe. I thought about cutting the fans and dropping to make him overshoot, but at the speed we were going, we'd crash and burn. "Hold on!" I yelled.
"Oh, shit!"
said Alina coy. I killed the thrust and went vertical. We exploded up through the canopy into the sky, shredding branches around us. The speeder shot by underneath. Astonished, he tried to bank round to re-engage, but my maneuver had flummoxed him. Just for a moment, but long enough. He didn't trim his thrust as he tried to make the turn. A tree took one stabilizer wing clean off, and that was the last I saw of him, except for the series of impact explosions he made under the trees below us. I was shaking, my hands numb. Exhaustion punched into me. The concentration had been so terribly intense. But Midas, I was sure, would have been proud of me. He'd forever been trying to teach me his skills, and he'd declared on more than one occasion that I'd never make a combat pilot. In his opinion, I had the essential reflexes and strength, but I never saw the big picture. And it was always that last, overlooked detail that got you killed. That last overlooked detail came in from the north, across the treetops, autocannons flashing. Chapter 10. Down. Dr. Berschilde of Ravello. Cagnard the Sharp. It was the fourth speeder that had been hunting us. Before I could even let out a curse, its streaming cannon fire had severed our tail boom and mangled the aft fan, shredding off its cover and twisting the still-spinning props. We started to rotate violently. The cabin vibrated like a seizure victim. Elena screamed. I wrestled with the controls, fighting the bucking stick. I cranked the wing fans to vertical and throttled up to break the drop. The flyer crunched down through upper branches, glanced off a main bough, and nose-dived. I stood on the rudder and yanked back the stick. "Brace!" I yelled. That was all I had time to say. We sideswiped a Fanewood's trunk, a collision that ripped off the port fan and stripped the monocoque's hull paint down to the bare metal, and bounced once off a peaty ridge of moss and leaf mould. Then we rose again, yawing to the left as the remaining turbofan screamed to the edge of its tolerance, trying to gain some sort of lift. The engine-out alarms shrilled as the fan stalled, overcome by the pressure. We fell then, sideways, survived a headlong impact with an oak that crazed the windshield and slammed into the loamy earth, slithering a good 50 meters before we rocked to a halt on our side. I didn't black out, but the long silence following the crash made it feel like I had. I blinked, lying on my shoulder against the side hatch. Elena moaned and Amos started coughing. The only other sound was the tinkling patter of the shattered windscreen scads gradually collapsing into the cabin. I got up and clambered over the seats. "Elena, are you hurt?"
No, sir. I don't think so.
"We have to get out. Help me." Together we dragged the coughing Amos clear and went back for Medea, who was still, mercifully, unconscious. The searchlights of the speeder lanced down through the hole we had made in the canopy, poking around. Any moment now. Elena and I dragged the other two into the shelter of a hollow, a good distance from the downed aircraft. "Stay here," I whispered to her. "Give me your weapon." Silently, she offered me her stubby las pistol. "Stay down," I advised, and ran back to the wreck, retrieving my staff and my sword. I tossed the rune staff into the undergrowth to keep it out of sight, and drew Barbarisata. The speeder was coming down through the upper branches, trying to pick out the flyer with its stab light. I tucked the sword and pistol into my belt and lunged up into the lower branches of the grosbeech that overlooked our crash site. The tree was huge and gnarled. Grunting, I swung myself up into the main boughs and then further up into the web of thinner branches. The speeder hovered into view, crawling slowly towards the smoking wreck, its searchlight playing back and forth. I could see the masked side gunner in the open door, one hand on the yoke of the pintle-mounted autocannon, the other on the bracket of the lamp. The speeder descended. I climbed higher, up into the lofty reaches of the beach, until I could climb no further, and the hovering speeder was directly below me. The pilot said something. I distinctly heard the crackle of his intervox. The door gunner replied and let go of the lamp, setting both hands on the cannon's grips, turning it to aim down at the crumpled flyer. The glade below me filled with flashes and booms as he riddled the airplane with his cannon fire. The valiant little Urdeshi craft shredded like tinfoil. The door gunner stopped shooting and called down to his pilot. Now or never. I let go of the branches and dropped straight onto the roof of the speeder. It rocked slightly beneath me. I steadied myself, crouched down, gripped the upper frame of the door hatch and swung in, boots first. The gunner was bent over with his back to the hatch, getting a fresh ammunition box from the wall rack. My boots connected with his lower back and shunted him face first against the cabin wall. I landed beside him as he staggered backwards, his hands clutching at his broken face, grabbed him by the arm and propelled him backwards out of the hatch. We were 10 meters up. The pilot gave a muffled grunt as he looked round and saw me. A second later, the muzzle of the las pistol was pressed against the corner of his jaw. "Set down. Now," I said. I prayed I was dealing with a mercenary and not a cultist. A merc would know when to cut his losses and bargain to live for another day and another paycheck. A cultist would fly us into the nearest tree, gun or no gun. Making his motions very slow and clear so I could be sure to read them, the pilot cut the speeder's main thruster and sank us to the forest floor. "Shut us down," I said. He obeyed, and the lift units hummed to a halt. The dashboard went blank apart from a few orange standby lights. "Unstrap. Get out." He unbuckled his harness and slowly pulled himself up out of the pilot's seat as I covered him with the pistol. He was a short but well-built man in ablative armor and a grey flight helmet with a breathing visor. He jumped down from the speeder's side hatch and stood with his hands raised. I got down next to him. "Take off the helmet and toss it back into the speeder." The pilot did as he was told. His skin was pale and freckled, his thinning hair shaved close. He regarded me with edgy blue eyes. "Unzip the suit." He frowned. "To the waist." Keeping one hand raised, he drew the zipper of the ablat suit down, revealing an undervest and shoulders marked with old, blurry tattoos. The psi shield was a small, disc-shaped device hung round his neck on a plastic cord. I snapped it off and tossed it into the undergrowth. Then I used my will. "Name," he growled, grimacing. "Name." "I know Goran." I nudged my mind against his. It was like rubbing up against something sheathed in plastic. "Right, we both know that's an inflated identity." A rush job from the feel of it. "Real name?" He shook his head, his teeth clenched. M-plate IDs were cheap enough to buy on the black market, especially a fairly poor quality one like this. They were fake personalities, usually sold with matching papers, psi woven over the subject's persona like a fitted dust cover on a piece of furniture. Nothing fancy. If you had the money, you could buy fingerprints and retinas to match. If you really had the money, a new face too. This one was like a false wall erected in a hurry to ward off casual minds. It lacked any sort of real history, not even vague biographical engrams. A mind mask as cheap and unrealistic as the carnival faces his comrades had worn. But, though poor, it had been put in place with great force. I tried to shift it, but it wouldn't budge. That was frustrating. It was obviously false, but I couldn't get past it. There was no time to worry at it now. "Out," I willed, and he collapsed unconscious. "Elena, Amos, come on," I shouted, dragging the limp man back into the speeder. I checked him for weapons. There were none, and then lashed his hands behind his back with a length of cable from the speeder's pulley spool. By the time Elena and Amos reached me, carefully bearing Medea, I had the pilot gagged and blindfolded and tied to one of the speeder's internal cross-members. We got everything aboard, the items we had rescued from my study, the rune staff, all of it, and secured Medea in a pull-down cot in the aft of the speeder's crew bay. Then I got into the pilot's seat and, once I'd made sense of the control layout, got us airborne. I edged up just above the treetops, running unlit. The moon was up and the night was clear, apart from a brown smudge against the stars away to the north. The smoke from my burning estate, I had no doubt. There was no sign of anything else in the air. Hugging the tips of the trees, I turned us south. Once we were underway, I checked out the cockpit. It was clearly an ex-military flyer, bought for the purpose, in my opinion. Insignia mouldings had been chiseled off, service numbers erased with acid swabs. Apart from the basic controls, the cabin was provided with several socket racks where optional instrument modules could be bolted in. Only a Vox set had been fitted. There were gaps where an Auspex, a terrain reader, and night vision displays might have gone, and also slots for a navigation codifier and a remote fire control system that would have slaved the door weapon to a pilot and done away with the necessity of a separate gunner. Whoever had supplied the mercenaries with their vehicles had provided only the most basic package. An armed troop lifter with an old model Voxcaster comm. No automated systems. No clue to origin or source. But it had decent power and range, over 1,000 kilometers left in it before it would need a recharge. Something to get them in, lay down cover, and get them out again. The forest flickered by beneath us. The Vox burbled intermittently, but I had no idea of the codes or cant they were using, and little desire to let anyone know the flyer was still operational. After a while, it shut off. I unplugged it, pulled it out of its rack, and told Elena to toss it overboard. Why? She asked.
I don't want to risk it having a tracker or transponder built into it. She nodded. I tried to get our bearings manually, using the basic instrumentation, working to reconstruct a map of the area in my head. It was pretty much guesswork. D'Orsay, the nearest main city, was perhaps an hour west of us now, but given the scale of the operation mounted against me, I felt going there would be like flying into a Carnodon's den. There were small fishing communities and harbour towns on the east side of the Inshum headland, the closest now more than 2 hours away. Madua, a chapel town in the southeast, was in range. So was Entrive, a market city on the fringe of the wild woodland. So were the Atenate Mountains. I thought about calling the Arbites on the Vox, but decided against it. The attack on Speyton House must surely have been noted by sentries at D'Orsay, especially once the main fires started, but no emergency support units had come. Had the Arbites been paid to turn a blind eye? Had they been more complicit still in the raid? Until I understood who and what my enemies were, I could trust no one, and that included the authorities and even the Inquisition itself. Not for the first time in my life, I was effectively alone. I headed for the mountains, for Ravello. Ravello is a hill town in the flanks of the western Atenates, situated at the foot of the Insa Pass, on the shores of a long freshwater lake that forms the headwaters of the Great Drunner. It has a small but distinguished universitariate, specializing in medicine and philology, a brewery that exports its lakewater ale all over Gudrun, and a fine chapel dedicated to St. Calwan, which houses, to my mind, some of the best religious frescoes in the subsector. It is a quiet place, steep and densely packed, its old buildings lining narrow hill streets so tightly their green copper roofs overlap like plate armor. From the air, it looked like a patch of dark moss clinging to the blue slopes of the Itaval. The sun was rising as we approached from the north. The air was clear, a baking blue. We had left the wild woodland in the first touches of dawn and climbed up into the foothills, following the line of the Atenate miners up into the higher altitudes. The Itaval was high enough to have cloud cover round its peak, but across the lake the first of the great giants rose. Esembo, ragged like a tooth. Mons Fulco, a violet triangle stabbing the sky. Snow-capped Corvaccio, the sport and bane of recreational climbers. We were nearly out of power, and the speeder was getting sluggish. I dropped us to road level and came in through the western gate. There were no traffic and no pedestrians. It was still early in the morning. The streets were paved with the same blue-grey ooslite that the buildings were constructed from, bright in the sunlight, dank in the shadows of the narrow streets. We passed through a square where a student lay, sleeping off a night's drinking on the lip of a small fountain, along a wider avenue where ground cars and civilian flyers were parked in a herringbone, and then turned up a narrow street and climbed the hill out of the glare of the sun. I opened the speeder's windows and breathed in the fresh, clear air. The muted sounds of the flyers' engines washed back at me, reflected oddly by the tall, shuttered faces of the dwellings on either side of the steep, paved lane. It had been a long time, but I still knew my way around. We parked in a cul-de-sac alley just off the lane, little more than a blunt courtyard where a mountain spurra struggled to grow against the face of a wall. The spurra, or at least its little yellow spring flowers, were the emblem of St. Culwin, and votive bottles and coins littered the little stone basin the tree was growing from. A first-floor shutter twitched at the sound of our engines, and I was glad I had asked Amos to stow the door gun during our flight. At least we resembled a private transport. "Stay here," I told Alina and Amos. "Stay here and wait." I walked back down the street in the quiet morning. I was still wearing the boots, breeches, shirt and leather coat I had put on before the auto seance the night before. But Amos had lent me his drab green cloak. I made sure I was displaying no insignia or badge of office, except my signet ring, which would pass notice. Medea's auto pistol, reloaded with shells from a box magazine we found on the speeder, was tucked into the back of my belt. A stray dog, coming up from the town centre towards me, paused to sniff my cloak hem and then trotted on its way, uninterested. The house was as I remembered it, halfway down the lane. We had passed it on the way up, and now I made certain. 4 stories, with a terrace balcony at the top under the eaves of the copper-tiled roof.
The windows were shuttered, and the main entrance, a pair of heavy panelled wooden doors painted glossy red, were bolted shut. There was no bell. I remembered that. I knocked once and waited. I waited a long time. Finally, I heard a thump behind the doors, and an eye slit opened.
"What is your business so early?"
asked an old man's voice. "I want to see Dr. Berschilde."
"Who is calling?"
"Please let me in, and I will discuss it with the doctor."
"It is early,"
the voice protested. I raised my hand and held my signet ring out so its design was visible through the eye slit. "Please," I repeated. The slit shut. There was a rattle of keys, and then one of the doors opened into the street. Inside was just shadow. I stepped into the delicious cool of the hall, my eyes growing accustomed to the gloom. A hunched old man in black closed the door behind me.
"Wait here, sir,"
he said, and shuffled away. The floor was polished marble mosaic that sparkled where scraps of exterior light caught it. The wall patterns had been hand-painted by craftsmen. Exquisite antiquarian anatomical sketches lined the walls in simple gilt frames. The house smelled of warm stone, the cold aftersense of a fine evening meal. Smoke. "Hello?" A voice filtered down from the stairs above me. I went up a flight, onto a landing where shutters had been opened to let the daylight stream in. "I'm sorry to intrude," I said. Gregor Eisenhorn." Dr. Berschilde of Ravello took a step towards me, registering sleepy astonishment. She was still a very fine figure of a woman. I think she was about to hug me, or plant a kiss on my cheek, but she halted and her face darkened. "This isn't social, is it?" she said. I went back to the speeder and flew it round to the private walled courtyard behind her residence, where it was screened from view. The doctor's old manservant, Fabes, had opened the ground-floor sundoors and stood ready with a gurney for Medea. Elena, Amos, and I followed them inside. I left the pilot, still in his will-induced fugue state, tied up in the flyer. Crezia Berschilde had put on a surgical apron by then and met us in the ground-floor hall. She said little as she examined Medea and checked her vitals. "Take her through," she told her man, then looked at me. "Anybody else injured?" "No," I said. "How is Medea?" "Dying," she said. All humour had gone from her voice. She was angry, and I didn't blame her. "I'll do what I can." "I'm grateful, Crezia. I'm sorry I've troubled you with this." "She ought to go to the town infirmary," she snapped. "Can we avoid that?" "Can we make this unofficial, you mean?" "Damn you, Eisenhorn. I don't need this." "I know you don't." She pursed her lips. "I'll do what I can," she repeated. "Go through into the drawing room. I'll have Fabes bring some refreshment." She turned on her heel and disappeared into the house after Medea. "So," said Amos quietly, "who is this again?" Dr. Crezia Berschilde was one of the finest anatomists on the planet. Her treatises and monographs were widely published throughout the Helican subsector. After years of practice in Dorsey and, for a period, off-world on Messina, she had taken up the post of professor of anatomy here at Ravello. And, a long time ago, I had nearly married her. 145 years earlier, in 241 to be exact, I had lost my left hand during a firefight on Sameter. The details of the case are unimportant, and besides, they are recorded elsewhere. I was fitted with a prosthetic, but I hated it and never used it. After 2 years, during a stay on Messina, I had surgeons equip me with a fully functioning graft. Crezia had been the chief surgeon during that procedure. Becoming involved with a woman who has just sewn a vat-grown clone hand onto your wrist is hardly a way to meet a wife, I realize. But she was quick-witted, learned, vivacious, and not put off by my calling. For years we were involved, on and off, first on Messina, then at a distance, and then on Gudrun, once she had moved back to Ravello to take up her doctorate, and I had based myself at Speyton House. I had been very fond of her. I still was. It is difficult to know if I should use a word stronger than fond. We never did to each other, but there are times I would have done. I had not seen her for the best part of 25 years. That had been my doing. We sat in the drawing-room for over an hour. Fabes had opened the windows, and the day's brilliance blasted in, turning the tulle window nets into hanging oblongs of radiant white.
I could smell the clean, fresh chill of mountains. The drawing room was furnished with fine old pieces of furniture and filled with rare books, surgical curios, and display cases full of immaculately restored antique medical apparatus. Amos was quickly lost in close study of the items on display, murmuring to himself. Elena sat quietly on a tub chair and composed herself. I was fairly sure she was inwardly reciting the mind-soothing exercises of the distaff. Every few minutes she would absently brush a few strands of brown hair off her slender face. The doctor's man returned with a silver serving cart. Yeast bread, fruit, oily butter, and piping hot black caffeine. "Do you need anything stronger?" he asked. "No, thank you." He pointed to a weighted silk rope by the door. "Ring if there's anything you need." I poured caffeine for us all, and Amos helped himself to a hunk of bread and a ripe ploin. Elena tonged half a dozen lumps of amber sugar crystal into her little cup. "Who did it?" she asked at length. "Elena?" Who raided us, sir?" The simple answer: I have no idea. I'm working on possibilities. It may take us a while to find out, and first we have to be secure. Are we safe here? Yes, for the time being. "They were mercenaries," said Amos, dabbing crumbs from his wrinkled lips. "That is beyond question." I thought as much. "The pilot you captured. You saw the tattoos on his torso." I did, but I couldn't read them. Amos sipped his hot, sweet drink. "Base Futu, the language of the Vesserine Janissaries." "Really? Are you sure?" "Reasonably so," he said. "The man has a repatriation bond written on his skin." I considered this news. Vesser was a feral world on the rimward borders of the Antimar subsector that bred a small but hardy population, famous for its vicious fighters. Attempts had been made to form a guard regiment there, but the Vesserine were hard to control. It wasn't that they lacked discipline, but they found loyalty to Terra too cerebral a concept. They were bonded into clan families, understanding simply the material wealth of land, property, homestead, and weapons. As mercenaries, therefore, they excelled. They would fight, peerlessly, savagely, and to the death, in the Emperor's name, provided that name was stamped on high-denomination coinage. No wonder the attack on Spayton House had been so direct and efficient. In hindsight, it was remarkable any of us had got out alive. I was glad I hadn't known who they were at the time. If I had been told I was facing Vesserine Janissaries, I might have frozen up, instead of charging them head-on to rescue Medea. I took off the cloak Amos had lent me, and also my leather coat, and rolled up the sleeves of my shirt. The sun was warming the drawing room. I had just taken the pistol out of my belt to check it, when Cresia came into the room. She was peeling off surgical gloves, and when she saw the gun in my hands, her already sour look became fiercer. She pointed sharply at me, and then gestured outside. "Now," she said, curtly. I pushed the weapon into the folds of the cloak on the table, and followed her out, across the hall and into a sitting room hung with oil paintings and hololithic prints. The shutters in here were still shut, and she made no attempt to open them. She turned up the lamp instead. "Shut the door," she instructed. I pushed the door shut. "Cresia," I began. She held up a strong, warning finger. "Don't start, Eisenhorn. Just don't. I'm this damn close to throwing you out. How dare you—" "Medea," I interrupted firmly. "How is she?" "Stable. Just about. She was shot in the back with a laser weapon, and the wound was left untreated for several hours. How do you think she is?" "She'll survive?" "Unless there are complications. She's on life support in the basement suite." "Thank you, Cresia. I'm in your debt." "Yes, you damn well are. You're unbelievable, Eisenhorn. 25 years. 25 years I don't see you. I don't hear from you, and then you turn up, unannounced, uninvited, armed, and on the run, so it would appear, with one of your party shot. And you expect me just to take this in my stride?" "Not really. I know it's a terrible imposition. But the Cresia Bershilde I knew could cope with an emergency now and then. And she always had time for a friend in need." "A friend?" "Yes. You're the only person I can turn to, Cresia." She snorted scornfully and tugged off her apron. "All those years I was happy to be the one you could turn to, Gregor. And you never did. You kept me at arm's length. You never wanted me involved in your business. And now... She let the words trail off and shrugged unhappily. I'm sorry. You bring guns into my house, she hissed. I probably shouldn't tell you about the mercenary tied up in my speeder then, I said. She snapped round to look at me, incredulous, and then shook her head with a grim smile. Unbelievable. 25 years and you roll up at dawn, bringing trouble with you. No, no one knows I'm here. That's one of the reasons I came. Are you sure? I nodded. Someone raided my residence last night. Razed it. Murdered my staff. I don't want to hear this. We barely got out alive. I needed sanctuary and medical help for Medea. I needed to find somewhere I knew would be safe. I don't want to hear any more, she snarled. I don't want to be tangled up in your battles. I don't want to be involved. I have a nice life here, and you do need to hear it. You need to know what's going on. Why? I'm not going to get involved. Why the hell didn't you go to the Arbites? I can't trust anyone, not even the authorities right now. Damnation, Eisenhorn! Why me? Why here? Because I trust you. Because my enemies may have every known associate of mine on the planet under observation, every Arbites precinct, every office of the Ministorum and the Imperial Administratum. But our relationship is secret. Even my closest friends don't know we were ever associated. Associated? Associated? You know how to flatter, you pig. Please, Crezia. There are a few things I need to do. A few things I need to arrange. A little help I need to ask of you. Then we'll be gone, and you'll never have to worry about this again. She sat down on a chaise and rubbed her hands together anxiously. What do you need? To begin with, your forbearance. After that, access to a private Vox link. I'll need you to summon an astropath, if that's in any way possible, and also have your man purchase clothes and other items for us. The town tailors will be closed today. I can wait. There may be clothes here. Very well. Understood. There's a Vox link in my study. I went to look in on Medea, who was sleeping peacefully in the scrubbed medical suite built into the basement of Crezia's townhouse, and then retired to the room Phabes had prepared for me. Elena and Amos were in adjoining rooms, resting. I bathed and shaved, doing both activities on automatic as my mind worked things through. I discovered my body had acquired several new bruises since the day before, and a las graze across the thigh I hadn't even noticed. My clothes were dirty, torn and smoke-damaged, and the breeches were covered in burrs and sticky grass seeds. Phabes had laid some clothes out in my room, several changes of male attire. I recognized they were my own. I'd kept clothes here over the years, mostly soft, informal wear, to change into when I visited. Crezia had stored them. I didn't know whether to be delighted or alarmed. All these years, and she hadn't thrown out the possessions I'd left in her territory. They were fresh, too, as if aired or laundered regularly. I realized that Crezia Bershilde had always expected me to return one day. Perhaps it was the manner of my return that had upset her, that I came back for her help and not simply for her. I couldn't blame her for that. I wouldn't be pleased to see me now, considering the trouble I was in, and not if I had broken all links of friendship 2.5 decades before. The chapel bells were ringing in the town below, calling the faithful for worship. Lakeside inns were opening up, and the smells of roasting and herbs were carried on the breeze. I chose a dark blue cotton shirt with a thin collar, a pair of black twill trousers, and a short flat-fronted summer jacket of black suede. The boots I had been wearing the night before would have to make do, but I scrubbed them clean with a cloth. I wanted to tuck the pistol into my jacket, but I knew how Crezia felt about guns, so I left it, with Barbarisata and the rune staff, under the mattress of my bed. The sacks of scrolls and manuscripts Amos and I had rescued from Spaten were with him in his room. I had little else with me. My signet ring, a short-range hand-vox, some coins, and my warrant of office. A metal seal in a leather wallet. It was the first time since Jura that I missed my rosette. Fishig still had that, wherever he was. As I hung my leather coat up in the wardrobe, I felt a weight in it, and remembered that I did have something else. The Malus Codicium. It was an infernal book, thrice damned. I knew of no other copy in existence. One half of the Inquisition would kill me to get their hands on it, and the other half would burn me for having it in my possession. Quixos, the corrupt veteran inquisitor I had finally brought to account on Farnus Peter, had built his power upon it. I should have destroyed it when I destroyed him, or at least surrendered it to the Ordo. I had done neither. Using it, secretly studying it, I had increased my abilities. I had captured and bound Cherubale using its lore. I had broken open several cult conspiracies, thanks to the insight it had given me. It was only a small thing, fat, soft-covered in simple black hide, the edges of its pages rough and hand-cut. Innocuous. I sat down in the corner of the bed and weighed it in my hands. Splendid mid-morning sunlight shone in through the casement. The sky was blue. The slopes of the Itaval, visible from the rear of the house, a soft lilac. But I felt cold and plunged into darkness. I'd never really thought about why I had saved that hideous work for my own ends. Knowledge, I suppose. Curiosity. I had encountered prohibited artifacts many times in my life, the most notorious being the accursed Necrochuk. That loathsome thing had possessed a life of its own. It stung to the touch. It lured you in and coerced you into opening it. Just to be near it was to poison the mind. But the codicium was silent. It always had been. It had never seemed alive, like the other toxic, rustling volumes I have encountered. It had always been just a book. The contents were disturbing, but the book itself... I wondered now. The moment it had come into my possession, things had started to change. Starting with Cherubale and on to the bleak events on Jura. Maybe it was poisoning me. Maybe it was twisting my mind. Maybe I had crossed far too far over the line without realizing it, thanks to its baleful influence. Perhaps that was a measure of how evil it was, that it was painless, invisible, insidious. The moment you touched the Necrochuk, you knew it was a vile thing. You knew you had to resist its seductive corruption. You knew you were fighting it. But the Malus Codicium, so infinitely evil, so subtle, seeping slowly into a man's soul before he even knew it. Was that how a servant of the Emperor as great as Quixos had become a monster? I had always wondered why he had never seen what he was becoming, why he was so blind to his own degeneration. I opened the drawer of my nightstand and put the book inside. As soon as we were clear of Ravello, I would have to deal with it. I went down to Crezia's study and found the Vox link. There was a hololithic Pict unit, too, and I tuned that in. Morning broadcasts, weather, planetary news. I watched for some time, but there was no mention of any incident in the D'Orsay region. I had anticipated as much, but it was still unnerving. I used the Vox and listened into the Imperial channels, eavesdropping on Arbiti's frequencies, PDF transmissions, Ministorum links. Nothing. Either no one knew what had happened the night before at Spaten House, or they were staying ominously silent. I needed an astropath. If I was going to contact anyone, it would be off-world. I had no choice. I really couldn't trust anybody on the planet. The flyer was still parked in the back courtyard. Phabes had been good enough to run a power cable from the house, and the craft's batteries were recharging. It was hot in the yard. Insects buzzed in the thick spill of flowering bucanthus that covered the side wall. The mercenary was awake. He twisted his head from side to side as he heard me approach, blind and dumb. I tore the tape from his mouth and then filled a dish cup with water from a bottle I had borrowed from the kitchen. I held it up to his mouth. "It's just water. Drink it." He pursed his lips and turned his head away. "You'll dehydrate in this heat. Drink." He refused again. "Look, if you dehydrate, you'll become weak and far more vulnerable to my questions and mind probes." He paused and swallowed, but then shied away from the cup again as I brought it up. "Have it your way," I said, and put the dish down. The Vesserine were famously hardy. It was said they could go without food or water for days when battle demanded it. If he wanted to show off, it was fine by me. I rose and went over the body of the speeder carefully. I had borrowed a scanner wand from Crezia's study and set it to detect high and low band signals. Transponders, beacons, codes. I found nothing. For good measure, I swept the Vesserine too. Both flyer and prisoner were cleaned.
If the mercenaries were looking for us, they wouldn't find us because of the craft or pilot. It had taken me half an hour to sweep the vessel. I went back to the pilot. The mid-morning sun was now high enough to throw sunlight in through the flyer's side hatch, and he was obviously feeling the heat because he'd drawn his legs up into what shade remained. I offered the water again. No response. "Tell me your name," I said. His jaw clenched. "Tell me your name," I repeated, using the will now. He shuddered. "I know Goran." His voice was dry and slurry. "And before it was I know Goran, your name was what?" His resolve was strong. The Vesserine were a blunt race, with a high frequency of untouchables. Part of their martial training was to learn methods of resisting interrogation, and at first I thought he might have some well-developed mind trick to wall out psychic impulsions. But as I questioned him further, I began to suspect it was more to do with the emplated identity he was wearing. I'd tried to pick it away, but it still wouldn't budge. Crude and simple it may have been, but it was psychically riveted into place. Part of that profound fixture, I was sure, was acting as a screen. It wasn't that he wouldn't answer. He couldn't. "Gregor." I looked out of the hatch and saw that Crezia had come out into the yard. "Gregor, what the hell are you doing?" I got out of the flyer and drew her back towards the garden doors. The Vesserine had undoubtedly heard her use my name. It couldn't be helped. "That man's tied up like a damned cygnet," she said. "That man would kill me, given the chance. He's tied up for all our sakes. I have to ask him questions." She glared at me. She had changed into a long gown of blue satin with an epinchier trim. Her straw-blonde hair was tightly braided behind her head and held up by 2 golden pins. She was beautiful and haughty, just as I remembered her. Crezia had high cheekbones, a generous mouth, and pale brown eyes given to expressions of passion and intelligence. The only passion I had seen in them since my arrival had been fury. "Like a cygnet," she repeated. "I won't have it. Not in my house." "Then what do you suggest? Have you a secure room? One that can be locked from outside?" "Provide you with a cell for him? Pah!" she scoffed. "It's that or the flyer." She thought about it. "I have Phabes clear out a box room upstairs." "No windows." "They all have damn windows. But the room I'm thinking of has just a small vein light, not big enough for anyone to get through." "Thank you. I want to check him over." There was no good arguing. She inspected the man carefully. "Don't be alarmed. I'm Dr. He really doesn't need to know your name. Or mine. Think about it." She drew a deep breath. "I am a doctor. I'm only going to check on your health. Do you have a name?" He shook his head. "He's using the name Aino Goran." "I see. I know. This situation is unpleasant, but if you cooperate with me and with my associate here, it will work out for the best. Soon." Associate. I could feel the spiteful relish he put into that word. Crezia looked at me disapprovingly. "He needs to drink and eat. Drink particularly in this heat." "Tell him, not me." "You need to drink, I know. If you don't drink, I'll have to put you on a fluid drip." He allowed her to feed him the dish, and sipped slowly. "Very good," she said. Then to me, "His bonds are far too tight." "That's not going to change." "Then get him up and walk him round a little. Tie his hands the other way." "Later, perhaps. If you knew what he was, what he has done, you wouldn't be so humane." "I'm an officer of the Medica Imperialis. It never matters what they've done." We went back into the drawing room. His identity is emplated. I need to get past the barriers. To find out who he really is? To find out who he's working for. "I see." She sat down, a bit at a fingernail. She always did that when she was troubled. "You have medical stocks here. Zendocaine, Vulgate oxybarbital." "You're joking." I shook my head and sat down opposite her, deadly serious. I need a psychoactive, or at least an opiate or barbiturate, to loosen his willpower. "No, absolutely no way." "Crezia, I will not be a party to torture." "It is not torture. I'm not going to hurt him. I just need to open his mind." "No." "Crezia, I am going to do it. I have the mandate of the Holy Inquisition to perform interrogation, and these circumstances permit me an even greater latitude of emergency powers. Wouldn't you rather it be done under your expert supervision? In the latter part of the afternoon, we brought the Vesserine inside, and put him in the box room Phabes had cleared. There was nothing in the room but a bed frame and mattress. I removed his blindfold and then covered him with the auto-pistol as Amos removed his bindings. Crezier looked on, pointedly saying nothing about the weapon. "Unfasten your tunic again," I said. Crezier started to say something, but I cut her off. "You'll need to get at his arm, won't you, Doctor?" There was another reason for getting him to disrobe. Amos carefully studied the man's tattoos, making notes. The Vesserine just stood there, stripped to the waist, sullen. He refused to make eye contact. I noticed he was slender but whipcord tough. The marks of old scars dotted his torso. I'd taken him to be a reasonably young man, but either he was older than he looked, or his short life had been barbarically tough. Amos finished. "I'll get it translated properly, but it's what I thought it was." He turned to go downstairs. I stopped him and passed him the pistol. "Cover him, please." Amos waited while I retied the merc's hands. I tied them in front of his body now, and then lashed his ankles together and tied off the end of that cord to the bedstead. "Sit down," I told him. He sat. I took the weapon back from Amos, tucked it into my belt, and sent him on his way. "If you will, Doctor." She looked at me. "Just like that. Don't you want to give him the chance to volunteer first?" There was no point, but I wanted to keep Crezier on side. "Tell me your name," I said. "I know Goran." "Tell me your real name." "I know Goran." I shot a warning look at Crezier and used the will. I focused it in the Vesserine's direction so she would be spared, but it still made her shiver. He gurgled a non-verbal response. "Now, please." Crezier quickly injected 20 milliliters of Zendocaine into the man's upper arm and drew back. Zendocaine is a psychoactive, a synaptic enhancer that causes a flurry of cortex activity disguised by a soothing opiate. The man coughed, and after a few moments his eyes took on a glassy sheen. Crezier checked his blood pressure. "Fine," she said. I placed my hand on the man's temple and eased my mind into his. He was relaxed and offered no resistance, but his mind was lively. An ideal balance if I was going to prize off his emplated identity. I tried a few test questions, both verbally and mentally. His answers were slurred. "What is your name?" "I know Goran." "What is your age?"
40 standard.
"What is your height?"
2 1/3 quen.
That was a good sign. I had no idea what a quen was, but I'd take a bet it was a Vesserine measure. "Where are we?" I continued.
In the room.
"Where is the room?"
In a house. No.
"On what world?"
Gudrun.
"What color is the sky?"
This sky.
"Yes. What color is this sky?"
Blue.
"What other sky might I have meant?"
No.
"What is my name?"
Grego.
"How do you know that?" I asked, without reacting.
She called it you.
Crezier glanced at me nervously. "Who does that make me?"
No.
"Who might I be? Who do you suppose?"
Eisenhorn.
"Why do you know that name?"
Job.
"What job?"
Me. Merc work. Pay job.
"Tell me more about that."
Don't know more.
"What is your name?" I asked the mercenary again.
Told you. I know Goran.
"Where are you from?"
Hesperus.
"What color is the sky?"
Blue. Definitely.
"What is your name?"
I know Goran. I know Goran. I know Goran.
The words came out like a mountain stream, overlapping, light, without any meaning. "Where are you from?" I went on.
Hesperus. I don't know.
"What does the tattoo on your upper body signify?"
Bond.
"In what language?"
Don't know.
Is it a repatriation bond? Uh-huh. That's a mercenary custom, isn't it? It states for any captor to see that if you are returned to your homeworld or an agency of your homeworld unharmed, a bond will be paid. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Are you a mercenary?
Yes.
What color is the sky?
Blue. No. Yes, blue.
What is your name? I asked you, what is your name?
Wait. I know this. Be hard to think.
His eyes rolled in their sockets. What is your name?
Dunno.
Are you a mercenary?
Yeah.
Was I your target last night?
Yeah.
Who was your target last night?
Eisenhorn.
Am I Eisenhorn?
Yes.
He looked at me, but his eyes remained glassy, unfocused. What were your orders?
Chill 'em all. Burn the place.
Where did the orders come from?
Clansire Ettrick.
Is Clansire a rank?
Yeah.
Is Clansire Ettrick a Vesserine Janissary?
Yes.
Are you a Vesserine Janissary?
Yes.
What is your name, Janissary?
Sire. Vamiko Tal, sire.
He paused and blinked, not sure what he had just said. Krezia was staring at me. You're doing very well, Tal, I said.
Uh-huh.
The emplate was shredding away from his mind like damp paper now. I went in for the kill with my full willpower now his mind was open. Where were you hired?
20 weeks ago. 20 weeks.
Where was that?
Heveron.
What were you doing there?
Looking for work.
Before that?
Be hired for a border war. Local governor hired us. But the war fizzled out.
And you found a new client?
The clan sire did. Good pay for a long-term hire. Off-world. Transit paid.
To do what?
They didn't tell us. Shipped us off to some place.
Where?
Gudrun?
Was it Gudrun?
Yeah.
A shudder went through him. And the job? In outline?
Hardware and flyers provided by client. Told to hit this place on the headland. Chill everyone.
Whose place was this?
Be someone called Eisenhorn.
How many men were hired?
All of us. The entire clan.
And how many men is that?
800.
I paused. 800. All for this job on Gudrun?
No, be 70 of us for that. The rest for other jobs.
What other jobs?
Wasn't told. My head aches.
Krezia touched my sleeve. You must stop, she whispered. He's beginning to hyperventilate. Just a few more questions, I hissed back. I looked at Tal. He was sweating and rocking slightly in his seat as his breaths came quick and fast. Where did you stage before the raid?
Pitero.
A small island in the Bay of Bishin. Interesting. What was the name of the ship that brought you here?
The Bertrand.
What was the name of your client?
Dunno.
Did you ever meet him?
No.
Did you ever meet any of his agents?
Yeah. It hurts.
Gregor. Not yet. Tal. Who was the agent?
Woman. Psyker. She came to emplate us the night before the raid.
She personally fixed your identity veils?
Yes.
What was her name?
Call herself Mala. Mala Tare.
Picture her in your mind, Tal, I ordered. I got a brief but vivid flash of a sharp-featured woman with long, straight black hair. Her eyes were what I remembered most. Coal-edged, large and green, like jade. She seemed to look into my head. I snatched back. Are you all right? Krezia asked. Yes, I'm fine. We're going to stop now, she told me straight. Right now. Right now? That's what I said. The Janissary had sunk back on the bed, his skin puffy and damp. He closed his eyes and moaned. He's coming down. Now he's feeling the disruptions of your mind probe. I could see she was shaking slightly. She'd felt them too, second hand. One last question.
I said we were stopping now and I meant it. I have to stabilize him. I held out my hand. One more, while he's still open. We come back later or tomorrow and he'll have closed up. And you don't want to do this again, do you? No, she relented. Tal. Tal!
Go away.
What was the name of your client? What was the name of Marla Tare's boss? The Vesserine murmured something. What was that? Whispered Cressier. I didn't catch it. I had. Not verbally, but in my mind. Something blocked out. Something he hadn't been able to say before, even if he'd wanted to. As he collapsed into Psi Fugue, the last shreds of his emplated veil melted away, and the final name tumbled out. He said Kanya, I told her. Kanya the Sharp. Chapter 11. Adept Cielo. Death Notices. Dangerous Kindness. I woke before dawn. It was still twilight outside, and the curtains of my room swayed in the cold breeze. I got dressed and went downstairs. On the way, I checked on Tal. He was profoundly asleep, curled on his bed. Cressier had made sure he was all right, given him a secondary mild opiate to reduce his trauma, and covered him with a blanket. He'd been out for the best part of 14 hours. Cressier had almost flipped out with fear when she discovered the captive in her box room was a Vesserine Janissary. I checked Tal's bindings, and he groaned softly as I disturbed the blanket. Amos was already up. Drinking caffeine he had brewed himself, he sat in Cressier's study, listening to the early morning Vox broadcasts. "Couldn't you sleep?" I asked. "I slept fine, Gregor, but I never sleep for long." I fetched another cup and poured caffeine from his pot. "There's nothing about us," he said, gesturing to the Vox. "Nothing? It's most perturbatory. Not a word. Not even on the Arbites band. Someone managed to hire 800 Vesserine killers, Uber. They have clout. The news has been withheld, or censored. The others will know." "How do you mean?" "Fishig? Nail? The moment they don't get a response from Spate & House, they'll know something is up." "I hope so. What did you make of our friend's tattoos?" "Base Futu, just as I supposed. I cross-checked it using the doctor's cogitator." He took out a note slate and adjusted his eyeglasses. "This mark bears witness that Vermiko Tal, a Janissary, is owned by the clan Ettrick, and a bond of 10,000 zekel will be paid for his repatriation. He is of flesh made, and his flesh speaks for him." Amos looked up at me. "Strange practice." "Totally in keeping with the Vesserine mindset. Janissaries are objects, material items. You might as well keep a cannon or a tank as a prisoner of war. They have no political affiliation, no loyalties within the particular frame of whatever conflict they're involved with. No use as a hostage. Putting that little incentive on each one makes things clear and simple. Puts a simple price on the matter and dissuades a captor from simply killing them. How much is 10,000 zekel, then? Enough, I should think. What do we do with him when we leave? Now, there was a question. I went into the kitchen to brew more caffeine and hunt for bread, and found Cressier juicing ploins and mountain tarberries in a chrome press. Her hair was loose, and she was wearing a short cream silk house robe. "Oh," she said as I walked in. "I'm sorry," I said, retreating. "Oh, don't bother, Gregor. You've seen me in a lot less." "Yes, you have." "Fruit juice?" "I was looking for caffeine, actually." "How could I forget? Breakfasts on the terrace, me with my fruit and grain cakes, you with your caffeine and eggs and salt pork." I filled a pan from the sink pump and lit the stove. Then I rinsed out the pot. "I suppose now's your opportunity to tell me I told you so," I said. "What do you mean?" "You always said fruit and grain loaf was the path to a healthy life, remember? You used to go on about diet and fiber and all sorts. Told me my intake of caffeine and alcohol and red meat would kill me. I take it back." "Really?" "It won't be your diet that kills you, Gregor," she said, suddenly biting at a fingernail. "You were right, of course." "Look at you." "I'd rather not," she said, crushing a ploin with excessive force. "You're as lovely as the day I first met you." "The day you first met me, Gregor Eisenhorn.
You were half comatose with anesthetic, and I was wearing a scrub mask. How could I forget? She looked at me witheringly. Still, I said, I'm not lying. I treated you badly. I'm still treating you badly. Someone like you doesn't deserve that. She tasted her pulpy juice drink. I won't argue with any of that, but it's nice to hear you admit it. It's the truth. So's the fact you're still lovely. She sighed. Juvenat programs are all easy to administer. I look this way thanks to imperial science, not fruit juice. I still believe in fruit juice. She grinned. You don't look so bad yourself. Red meat and caffeine considered. The pan began to boil. I feel about 1,000 years old next to you. Life has not treated me kindly. Oh, I don't know. There's a nobility about your scars. Something very masculine about the way you wear your age well. I started to look in cupboards for the ground beans. That canister there, she said. The chicory blend you always used. I've never lost the taste for it. I took the tin canister and spooned out several measures into the pot. Cressier, I said, you should have let go of me a long time ago. I was never any good for you. I was never any good for anyone, truth be told. I know, she said, but I can't. That's just the way of things. I poured the boiling water into the pot and let it stand. How's Elizabeth? She asked suddenly. I had been sort of waiting for that. I had broken my long relationship with Cressier Berschilde, in the end, because of Bequin. Even though I knew Elizabeth and I could never be together in any way except friends, I knew I would never get past my love for her. It was too much in the way, and that could never be fair on Cressier. 25 years before, in that very house, I had told her as much, and walked away. She's dying, I said. Cressier put her glass down suddenly. Dying? Or already dead. I told her what had happened on Jura. Oh, God, Emperor, she said. You should go to her. What could I do? Be there, she said firmly. Be there, and tell her before it's too late. How do you know I haven't already told her? Because I know you, Gregor, too well. Well, the two of you never... I mean, no, she's an untouchable. I'm a psycho. That's the way it works. And you never told her? She knows. Of course she knows. But you never told her? No. She embraced me. I pulled her close. I thought of all the things I had never done, or never started, or never finished. Then I remembered all the things I had done, and could never undo. The last thing you want is me, Cressier, I whispered into her hair. I'll be the judge of that. The kitchen door burst open, and Amos limped in. Cressier and I let each other go. We could have been doing anything for all Amos cared. You have to come and hear this, Gregor, he said. He had been listening to the sub-sector service on the Vox, news from all around the Helican sub, some of it days or weeks old. By the time we were standing around the old set, the news had moved on to stock reports and shipping forecasts. Well, I asked. A report from Messina, Gregor. The upper levels of Spire 11 of Messina Prime were destroyed 24 hours ago by what was cited as a recidivist blast. I went cold. Spire 11, Messina Prime. That was the location of the residence I had leased for the use of the distaff. Nail and Burgundy had taken Elizabeth and Cara there. For safety. The report said that over 10,000 lives had been lost, Amos murmured. The Messina RBTs are hunting for suspects, but it's been attributed to a radical Free Messina outfit. I sat down, trembling. Cressier crouched beside me, hugging me. The distaff. Gone. Bequin, Nail, Cara Swole, Burgundy. It was too much. I realized why Kanyar the Sharp had hired so many Vesserine Janissaries. Multiple strikes, multiple worlds. What else had this Kanyar hit? What other pain had he already caused me? Who else had he killed? What's going on? Elena asked, coming in, rubbing her sleepy eyes. I paced the house and the courtyard garden. 2 or 3 times I started up towards the box room, the auto pistol in my hand. Damn the bond. I would have vengeance. Each time I turned back. I'd counseled Medea against vengeance, and so I should listen to my own good advice. Killing Tal would be like breaking a sword. What was it Medea had said? It's a displacement activity. It's something you can lock onto and do because you can't do the thing you really want to do. I needed something, and it wasn't payback. So what was it? I needed to get back in the game. I needed to round up my allies. I needed to discover who Kanya the Sharp was. And then, damn the advice I had given Medea. I needed to destroy him. At 9 sharp, Adept Cielo arrived with his clerk, having been summoned the day before. Both were hooded and cloaked, which I suppose was their idea of subtlety. I met with them in the drawing-room, with Cresia in attendance. She had dressed in a trouser suit of beige murrey. Adept Cielo was an elderly, experienced astropath, one of the best the guild house in Ravello had to offer.
I take it, sir, this is a private matter?
It is.
Are you purchasing my services in cash?
No, Adept, by direct fund transfer. I have a confidential message service which I wish to use. I expect the utmost discretion.
You have the guarantee of the guild, sir,
said Cielo. His clerk opened a data slate and offered me the thumbprint scanner. I pressed my thumb against it and then entered my code.
Ah,
said Cielo, as the slate chimed and displayed a readout.
That's all sorted out. Your accounts have released the funds. Everything's in order, Mr. Eising. Let us proceed.
Of course, I wasn't using any accounts that were connected with the person of Gregor Eisenhorn. I had good reason to suspect my finances were under observation, if not frozen. But I wasn't even going to try, because that would let my enemy know that someone with the authority to access Gregor Eisenhorn's accounts was still alive, and it would be comparatively simple to trace that access. As with the various properties I owned, I had resources under other identities. Gorton Eising had several holdings with the Imperial Thracian Treasury, with enough funds for my current needs. I had set up the confidential message service many years before, so that I could send and receive messages without using my real identity. It was essentially an automatically maintained mailbox account that I could access using an astropath from any location. I could send messages through it and read any communiques that had been posted to it. The service was registered under the name Aegis. When Cielo accessed the Aegis account, there were no communiques waiting to be read. Composing the contents in Glossia, I had Cielo send warning messages to Fishig on Jura, to Messina, to agents of my organization on Thracian Primaris, Hesperus, Sarum, and Cartol. I used the signature Rosethorn. I also sent a private, coded, anonymous transmission to a friend outside the Helican subsector. It was a single-word message that read, Sanctum. I would wait for responses before I contacted my Lord Rorken. I wanted to take things one step at a time. Not for the first time in my career, I wanted to stay out of sight, except to friends. Of course, even sending communiques in another name was risky. Many or all of the people I was trying to contact might be under surveillance themselves, if they hadn't already been eliminated. But Glossia was a private code. Even if my messages were intercepted, they would be impossible to decipher. The first responses arrived by noon the next day. Cielo's clerk came up from the guild house to deliver them. One was a message from Fishig in Glossia that essentially told me he was already en route from Jura and would arrive at Gudrun in about 20 days. I dispatched a reply that emphasized caution and told him to contact me when he was close. The message Sanctum had been answered with the words Sanctum arising in 15. There was no ident on the communique, and the source was deep space. The clerk then passed me a data slate. The communiques to Messina, Thracian Primaris, Hesperus, and Cartol have all been returned as undeliverable. That is strange. The message from Hesperus has a statement from the local arbites attached, recommending you get in touch with them directly. There has been no response from Sarum. After the clerk had left, I discussed it with Amos. He was as alarmed as I was. Undeliverable. Most perturbatory. And the interest of the arbites is disturbing. What progress with the names? I asked. He had been at work on Cresia's codifier all morning. Nothing.
No listing for a Mala Tare and nothing on any Kanyar the Sharp. A Kanyar is a blade weapon, of course, a curved dagger from ancient Terra. The word occurs in several Imperium cultures.
Can you resource further?
Not using this machine, but your doctor friend is going to walk me to the Universitariat this afternoon and get me access to their main data engines.
He was gone for hours, until late in the evening. Crezia had teaching duties to perform, and Phabes was all but invisible. I was left alone with Alina. I checked the prisoner. He was awake but unresponsive. Crezia had left him a tray of food and some water before leaving, but it was untouched. I tried a few questions, but he didn't stir. He was zoned out in a post-interrogation stupor. Medea was still sleeping, but her life signs were good, and there was no trace of post-operative infection. I kissed her forehead gently and went back to the kitchen. Alina was seated at the refectory table, 1/3 down a bottle of fine Hesperian claret. Without asking, she fetched me a glass and poured me some. I sat down with her. The kitchen doors were open, affording us a cool evening breeze and a fine view out over the courtyard to the Itaval. The mountain was ochre in the setting sun, and even as we watched, it gently shifted colour, becoming russet, then almost scarlet, then ultramarine.
Have you eaten? Alina asked.
No. Have you?
I'm not very hungry, she replied, and drank a mouthful of wine.
I'm sorry, Alina, I said.
Sorry, sir? Why?
Sorry that you should be in the middle of all this. It's an unpleasant business and costing us all dear. She smiled.
You got me out of Spaten alive, sir. For that, I'm thankful.
I only wish I could have got everyone out alive. She shrugged. I could tell she was haunted by the killing she had seen. Sastre's brave sacrifice in particular had scarred her. Alina Coy was only about 25, just a girl, and a new recruit to the distaff. She had not seen any active service in the field yet. She had been posted to Spaten as resident untouchable, something the distaff regarded as an easy job, to get her acclimatized to the work. Some acclimatization. If you'd like to leave, I think that would be all right. I could arrange some adequate papers, some money. You could get off-world, to safety. Alina looked almost offended.
I am a contracted untouchable in the pay of the distaff, sir. Perhaps, Emperor bless me, the last one alive. I knew service to an Inquisitor would be dangerous when I started. I'm under no illusions.
Even so.
No, sir. I'm strong enough for this. It may be extreme, but it's what I was hired to do. Besides.
Besides what?
Well, for one thing, we know that the enemy has at least one powerful psyker in his pay. That means you'll need an untouchable.
True.
And I think I'd feel safer sticking with you, sir. If I went off on my own, I'd be looking over my shoulder for the rest of my life.
Thank you, Alina. You could stop calling me sir now, though. If what we've been through these last few days can't be counted as a bonding process, I don't know what can.
Right,
she smiled. It was a change to see a smile in her face. She was tall and overly thin, in my opinion, always seeming edgy and nervous. The smile suited her. Neither of us said anything for a few moments.
So, what should I call you?
She asked eventually. We chatted idly for a while longer, until the Itaval had become black and the sky imperial blue. The stars were out.
Do we have a plan? She asked.
Theoretically, we find out who is set so murderously against us and hunt him down. Practically, that means staying here, out of sight, for a while at least. Then, getting off planet.
How long for that, do you think?
My preferred means of planet exit will be available in 15 days. She refilled our glasses.
I like that. I like it when you sound like everything's under control.
So do I chuckled.
So, once we're off planet,
what then?
Practically speaking.
It depends on a few things. What we manage to turn up in the next 2 weeks. Whether I dare correspond with the Ordos.
You don't think the Inquisition is involved, do you?
Not at all, I replied. It wasn't a lie, because I was sure we weren't in conflict with any external agency. But it wasn't entirely the truth, either. I had been in the job long enough to know that nothing is out of the question. But there was no point alarming her. It's simply that I think our enemy is so well coordinated, so well provided, that he's watching everything. If I contact the Inquisition, it could betray us. I took up my glass and drank a good measure of the fine red wine. So if nothing turns up, when we leave here, it's open. There are places we could run to find security, friends I could call upon. Our best bet might be to disappear and stay hidden until our plans are formalized. But I'm torn. I'd like to head to Messina, if there's a chance any of them are alive. Apart from roaming field agents engaged on diverse tasks, the Distaff headquarters on Messina represented my only other base of operations. If it was gone, and Spayton House too, I was cut adrift. I had many friends at the Distaff Hall. I hope they're all right. She looked at the table and fiddled with her glass. I suppose you're most concerned about Madame Bequin. Well, I began. She being such an old friend and colleague of yours, I mean. And that she was badly hurt on Jura. And everyone knows... She stopped suddenly. Knows what, Elena? Well, that you love her. Everyone knows, do they? You can't hide something like that. I've seen you together. You adore each other. But you're a Psyche and she's one of us. I know. That doesn't mean you don't love her, all the same. She looked at me and blushed. This wine, she said. I've said far too much, haven't I? No, Elena, said Cresia. Neither of us had heard her come in. Talk some sense into him, will you? He has to go back and see her. It's the right thing. Cresia was dressed in her formal tutorial robes. She took a glass from the rack, came to the table, and finding the bottle was empty, set about opening another. How was your day? I asked, trying to change the subject. I spent 4 hours lecturing the sophomore class on the principles of thoracic palpation. I've never seen such a crowd of ill-prepared dolts. When I got one fellow up for a practical, he took hold of the volunteer subject's thigh. How do you think my day was? She sat down with us at the table. I looked in on our guest. I'm concerned about his condition. He hasn't taken any food or drink, and he's only marginally responsive. I think you may have damaged him with your mental probings. Either that, I said, or he's having an adverse reaction to the drugs. Possibly. If he's the same in the morning, I'll run some blood work on him. Whatever, he's not well, and he's not comfortable. There's severe lividity in his hands and feet. You tied those bonds so damn tight. As tight as they needed to be, Cresia. He's a Vesserine Janissary paid to murder me, don't forget. Shut up, and pour me a drink. The moment Amos came in, past 10 o'clock, I could tell something was wrong. He was carrying a small pile of data slates and accepted a drink from Elena without question, which was unusual for him. His hand was trembling as he raised the glass to sip. Even Cresia could see this was not like him. Well, old friend? I asked. I spent hours resourcing those names, Gregor. Still nothing on this Kanyar, though I assembled a list of planets that still use the word. He slid a slate across to me. Marla Tare. A little more success there. Marla Tari was arrested by the Arbites on Halocan 5 years ago for participating in cult activity. She was pending trial when she escaped custody. She turned up twice more, on Felthon, where she was a known associate of the cult leader Berikin Passwold, and on Sansita, where she was wanted in connection with the murder of Hierarch Sansum and 5 Ministorum clerics. The Inquisition also has a warrant out for her restraint as a suspected rogue psyker. So, an active participant in cult activity, then. I looked at the extracts Amos had put on a slate. They didn't tell me much more. If I contacted the Inquisition, they'd have a more complete file. Despite the risks, I felt inclined to get in touch with Rorken. If it's the same woman, he replied. There was no picture, but the physical description matched my mind's retrieved image. What's her background? There's nothing on that, except that when questioned during her detention on Halocan, she claimed to be 37 and stated her birth world was Gudrun. Interesting, I said. We should check her details against the planetary census, and I believe you pay me to be thorough, Gregor, said Amos churlishly. I've already done that. There's no record of her here.
In fact, there is no one on Gudrun with the surname Tare or Tari. The surname does, however, occur on other worlds. Too many, in fact, to be of any help. So, Savant, said Cressier, what's really troubling you? Amos took another glug of wine and pushed a slate into the center of the table. I was running out of options with the names, so I turned to something else. I inspected the news registers from across the subsector, hunting for keywords. You won't like it. I read down the slate, my heart turning to cold stone. It showed me bulletin reports of incidents from several planets in the sub. Just little items, most of which wouldn't even have made column space beyond the regional news wires. Certainly the events reported wouldn't have been planetary news, and definitely not interplanetary. Amos had only found them because he had been specifically looking and trawling the Imperium's newswire data compendium. The first report was of the explosion on Messina Prime, the main hive, Spire 11. The blast had occurred at 10:50, local. That was chilling. By my estimation, the raid on Spaten had commenced at precisely the same time, given sidereal adjustments. The explosion had incinerated the uppermost 10 levels of the spire. The death toll was put at 11,600. The Lord Governor had declared a state of emergency. There was a long appended list of properties and businesses destroyed. Amongst them, halfway down the second page, was the Thorn Institute, the name by which the distaff had been publicly known. No survivors. I supposed it could have been a coincidence, but I didn't believe in them. Which meant that my foe, this Kanyar the Sharp, had not hesitated to exterminate thousands of civilians just to take out the distaff. The news file stated that a proscribed movement calling itself the Scions of Messina had claimed responsibility. That group, it said, struck for Messina's independence from the Imperium, which was frankly rubbish. Messina was as imperial as a planet culture got. The second report listed on the slate was filed from Kartol. A family touring Connor Province on vacation had been found murdered by unknown gunmen. 2 men and 3 women. Identities were to follow as soon as they had been established. Authorities on Kartol estimated the time of death at between 10 and midnight, 2 days back. I had sent my agent, Leris Finton, along with Byron Fakal, Lois Naran, and 2 untouchables, to Kartol 5 months earlier, to gather evidence concerning a death cult in the Connor region,